Hello and welcome back to Inclusive Design 24 2020, brought to you in partnership with Barclays Access, Adobe, Intopia, Tetralogical and InfoAxia. You can follow us on Twitter at ID24Conf, and if you have any questions for the presenters, please tweet them using the ID24 hashtag for our QA at the end of each session. A reminder that ID24 is a respectful community, and you can find our code of conduct on the inclusivedesign24.org event site.
And now I would like to introduce our next speaker, Errol Fox, who will be talking to us about UX research and ethnographic design for humanitarian technology. Take it away, Errol.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the lovely introduction. So welcome to this talk about doing user experience research and ethnographic design in humanitarian technology. So the projects that I reference in this talk are in the areas of peace building and crisis response. So peace building is about a peaceful world and things like peacekeeping, peaceful activity against violence, and crisis response typically refers to things like natural disasters and also human-made disasters sometimes as well. There will be some specific stories and also some general tips and advice for undertaking user experience research or field work in typically a country or community that isn't of your origin or your residence. So to just cover a few of the content warnings that will be covered in this talk, we have some topics such as violence against women being discussed. We have specifically the Manchester Arena bombing, that was the Ariana Grande event. We have radicalization of youth and terrorism mentioned, natural disasters, colonialization, racism, and educational or social status prejudice. Also, some of the visual slides will have no photos or copies, please. Please do not take any screen grabs or use these outside of this video and this presentation for this conference. They have given their consent to be part of the slide deck for talks, but not to be redistributed in any way. So just a little bit more flavor about me and what I do and who I am. So I'm Errol. I use they, them pronouns. My background is in product design and user experience. I've been a designer for about 10 years now, although that might be longer now. I lose track. But I've also been in the humanitarian sector or the nonprofit NGO sector for about 7 years, and that is both voluntarily and also more recently as paid professional work. And to mention as well that I've been in the open source or the FLOSS community for about 2 or 3 years now. So free and libre open source software is what the acronym FLOSS stands for, but typically I just tend to use open source software if I'm going to reference it in any talks. I am starting a PhD next year, which is super exciting for me, around humanitarian open source software and the interaction that designers have with those kinds of tools. And my current role is a designer at the Open Food Network, where we create an open source platform for producers and shoppers to buy different food related items and sometimes not food related items. And the idea is to shorten the food supply chain and to have food justice be more readily available to people globally. The content of this talk is actually from a previous position though. So this was when I worked at an organization called Ushahidi. Ushahidi is a Kenyan-based NGO and they make open source humanitarian technology for human rights cases and human rights needs. On the screen at the moment, you can see an example of that, and I'll just explain what you can see if you can see them. And this is the example around where one of our tools, one of the tools that Ushahidi creates, which is a data collection platform, which was used by communities in Nepal during the earthquake, and where that same citizen data was used by the Nepalese army to send medical response. So a lot of what Ushahidi made tools-wise and worked with and on projects-wise were for different crisis response cases, citizen empowerment, election monitoring and democracy, and basically citizen-led reporting around human rights cases and abuses. Before I dig into some of the deeper content in this talk, you may have heard of terms like developing countries or the global south when engaging with humanitarian work or hearing about NGO work. And NGO, if you aren't aware, stands for non-governmental organization. Essentially, it can mean sort of like a non-profit. But these labels for developing countries and the global south are usually used for other places that aren't Eurocentric or Western centric, and there's not really perfect language to use here. When I talk about the projects that I've worked on as a user experience and product designer, I'll typically refer to specific countries where applicable and when I can. And one label and term that I'm trying out and more recently to use instead of developing countries is the underrepresented majority, or not your country of origin or residence is sometimes what I'll be using in reference to the projects later on in this talk. But please excuse me if I do slip back into developing countries as a terminology. Language is ever evolving and ever more becoming inclusive. So the first project that I'm referencing in the further content of this talk is a project called Izuku, which means Fountain of Peace in Kinyarwanda, which is one of Rwanda's national languages. Izuku is a 3-year EU-funded consortium project undertaken by universities and nonprofits, NGOs, and various companies. The organisations involved in the Izuku project are King's College London, the University of Makerere, an organisation called Dotsoft, Leiden University in the Netherlands, the Aegis Trust, Kigali Collaborative Research Centre, and Ushahidi. Izuku's aim is and was to explore the potential of digital technologies to support peace through testing and development in Rwanda and Kenya over the period of the 3 years of the grant project. And you can find out more information at izuku.eu, and Izuku is spelled ISOOKO. On the screen at the moment, you can see a photo of some of the people that visit the Kigali Peace School in Rwanda. And the second project that I'll reference sometimes in the further talk content is called Dispatcher. And this was a shorter minimum viable product project that Ushahidi undertook over the course of 6 months. And it was funded by a grant giving organization. And it looked at the aim was to discover whether technology could help people create and maintain resilience in times of crisis. So this was actually a little bit before COVID-19 and our current situation. We were doing research into what do people do to build resilience when crises happen, and what kinds of technology aids them and helps them rather than overwhelms them. And we were looking specifically at things like community cohesion, how people globally help each other as well as locally help each other, and the link of resilience in an individual capacity as well as this group capacity, and all the different kinds of ways that you could facilitate that through technology. You can find out more information about Dispatcher, although it is an unfunded project at the moment, a bit.ly link, which is bit.ly/USH-Dispatcher. So the first thing to talk about when we talk about UX research and doing design for technology kinds of tools within these humanitarian contexts are really why Rwanda and Kenya. So it might feel like a given or pretty obvious to be doing humanitarian technology work in these places, and generally lots of humanitarian work. But one of the things that I'd like to emphasize, and one of the first pieces of advice to offer you all when working with this kind of project and this kind of sector, is it's really important to understand and explore why you're doing work in a specific location. So for the two projects that I explained, both Izuku and Dispatcher, Rwanda's history with genocide led to a number of different social policies and projects that worked on and around peace. And Kenya's history with tribal and political conflict allowed exploration into crisis. But when you're looking at where to conduct your research, you should be asking yourself these different questions. Why is this the country or city I want to investigate this problem in? What can I learn from the community here that I might find more difficult in my country of residence or my country of origin? And what unique problems am I committing to solve by doing research in this location? This is such a good practice to get into, even if you already have an idea of where you're going to do your user experience research projects for technology tools, even if it's kind of your marketplace is set in a particular area, particular region, or a particular country, it's still such a good practice to get into to ask these kinds of questions. So even though Rwanda and Kenya were and are legitimately some of the best places to conduct this kind of study, grant funding often stipulates in a proposal phase when you ask for the money where this research should happen. And most humanitarian work tends to be funded through grants, although there are some flexibility that's coming in actually much more recently. Grants are less strict with what you have to do where more recently, which is a great evolution of this kind of work. But what this does is where if the grant that you're applying for to do technology related and design related work stipulates where you should be doing that work, it restricts the opportunity to discover other locations where this research or where this tech tool, where something could be done, unless there is some further funding or another partner organization in this other location that you can work with. And one of the things that I found myself doing on both of these projects, both Izuku and Dispatcher, was doing research when I was going to other locations for other kinds of work. I was still sort of researching as I was doing other things on the topic of peace building and the topic of crisis response. And these other locations were places like Kazakhstan, Tunisia, Romania, and lots of other kinds of places and lots of other different kinds of communities and populations based in those places. Connected to that kind of consortium approach and grant-funded activity, there is a tricky thing around academia being involved, where often the methodologies that you need to use within the design phase of a tech tool build can be quite restrictive. And as practitioners, so myself, I'm a practitioner, not yet an academic. My academic life will start in January 2021. But as practitioners, we often use methods that will either gain us pathways that we are interested in exploring for the kinds of results that we hypothesize that we want to investigate, whereas academia tends to also want to test the methodological and the application of that methodology and its relevancy. So there is often an important aspect to test for that method. And this is where sometimes academia and practice within these kinds of humanitarian projects can find differences in opinion. So I've had, many a deep debate with our academic partners on the need and the essential need actually for flexibility within what we're going to do with the populations and with the communities for our UX research, and how, on the topic of inclusivity, how we're being inclusive to what they need and what they require from the tool eventually, as well as this approach of being aware of the methodological and the academic needs as well. For Izuku, we used a methodology, if you're curious about how we actually structure things, called Living Labs, which we applied to our work with the public. So we did 2 different groups, which I'll go into in a moment. Living Labs is an interesting methodology to look up. I would highly recommend doing a search for it. There's a big research document on it, but it is somewhat participatory in its approach, but you involve the users and the stakeholders of the process in co-creating those solutions. So it sits more closely with open source software than it does necessarily participatory design, but it does feel familiar if you're familiar with participatory design. With Dispatcher, we actually didn't have any academic partners involved, therefore we were able to play with how we approached the research as far as methodologies go. So to move into the user experience design activities and what we did with participants, like how did we structure this research, and how can you structure research as well for building tech tools in communities that you maybe want to learn more about or you're not particularly familiar with as a standard. So when we looked at how to engage people in our research, the civil society organizations, which I will refer to as CSOs from now on, were really an integral stakeholder of peace, and therefore a key group to involve within our research activities. And civil society organizations are any kind of community-based project. Maybe they're a local government, maybe they're a sort of branch of local government, or maybe sometimes a humanitarian organization as well. But this was the term that was used locally in Kenya for these kinds of groups. And what we quickly discovered when we wanted to start including not only people of the general public, but also these civil society organizations in our humanitarian research, was that from previous experience, a team member that I was working closely with that was Kenyan native based out of Kenya, had done in-depth experience and worked with CSOs a lot, flagged that they would have a lot of very different needs and expectations than the general public. And we really wanted to have those early conversations about flexibility to be able to meet those needs. So we needed to offer civil society organizations value beyond participation, just participating in different activities and events and workshops. And what we really needed to offer them with how we structured our UX research and product research was insight into how they do their own work with their communities. That was key to them. So what we actually did, the activities that you may or may not find these terms familiar, we did for the public workshops. We did user journeys, we did personas, we did stakeholder mapping, and we did something called rapid prototyping. Rapid prototyping can look a little bit different depending on what methodology you use, but essentially it was building ideas that were possibly actionable there and then within workshops. We actually decided to omit one activity with the public in the spirit of this flexibleness and being inclusive to what we believed would work well within the public. And that was a more in-depth look at, it was kind of an adjacent persona piece of work. It was, again, a little bit too kind of involved, and for the time that we had and for the people that we were working with, we decided to omit that piece of research work. And for the CSOs, what we actually drastically changed what we did with the CSOs after having these conversations about flexibility. We really focused on sharing what we had learned from the public with the CSOs and helping them to come to an understanding of a definition of peace collectively as different organizations with different aims, understanding the user journeys of the public that had created them in the days previous and the personas that they'd created. We did lots of tech tool demos for civil society organizations so that they could feel like they were ready to work in technology tools. And we did something called impact mapping with the civil CSOs, which looked at their services or their programs in a NGO context and how those already existing programs of work impacted based off of the information that we were gathering from the public. So what we were doing is trying to give them that value, that active value on the current things that they were working with. So I think you can maybe gather from my emphasis on flexibility around these different ways of approaching communities and places where you're doing your UX research, that it is really, really key to be flexible within the boundaries and be willing to adapt activities for good reasons. In fact, we did 2 public workshops, and we did one version of doing personas on the first workshop with the public, and it really just didn't work. The way that we'd structured the persona exercise just didn't go down very well with the people. So we decided to change that for the next day, and we changed it from a sort of paper-based individual persona building exercise to a more of an interview somebody in pairs and build a persona based off of that interview and asking questions, and that worked so much better for the environment that we were working with. So another small piece of advice is that I found really useful to learn as I was working within these humanitarian technology contexts and with different communities trying to build good tech for them, was that some countries that you might do this kind of work in are used to an aid presence, and they are what I call non-profit language proficient. So it really does take a bit of time and a bit of effort and empathy, really, and actually being interested in these communities beyond what they can offer you and you can offer them, to really break out of this aid-orientated language, because sometimes these communities and these groups are really, really used to telling people like me who come in from a European UK context, saying certain things to us to appear either more proficient or more knowledgeable, or maybe even have access to certain things that I would have access to as a organization working with humanitarian work. So just be aware of and sympathetic to this way of working with communities around this aid proficiency language. You'll tend to be able to notice it from whether or not community members are wearing a lot of branded clothes, like baseball caps or t-shirts with different, like Save the Children or the World Bank or US, or all these different organizations give out their branded merchandise. And so that's maybe one thing to look at. It's definitely not a blanket statement that everybody will be that way, but just it's maybe a good indicator of being aware. The next thing that I'm going to delve into is quite heavy, quite big topic. We're going to talk now about working with trauma in these 2 projects and 2 contexts. So one of the things that is absolutely, I believe, critical as a person working in tech, specifically as a designer, because you'll tend to be closer to the users and closer to the people and communities, is that understanding and dealing with traumatic subject matter is really something that I emphasize getting used to working with. And I anticipated this working both on the Izuku project and the Dispatcher project. So this is an example of this is a picture of one of the groups that we worked with. Their name is the Polycom Development Project, or Polycom Women. You can find them on Facebook at /Polycom Development Project. Polycom is spelled Polycom, Polycom. So this is a group of women in a informal settlement, or more commonly known as a slum area in central Nairobi in Kenya, called Kibera. And they do lots of different peace building activities. I'll just give an example of one. But they will do things like, when they know that there is civil unrest or something is bubbling under the surface of their communities as far as violence could be incited, they will go to areas where this is likely to happen, where violence is likely to break out, and they will do things like play football really badly as a group of older, usually, well, actually it's intergenerational, there's lots of different age ranges here, but they will play football badly. And these women can play football really well, especially by now, the amount of times that they go out and play football in the streets. But the idea of it is to go out and distract usually the younger people that are incentivized into violence. And what they'll do is, instead of starting the violent activity, they'll intervene and start teaching the women to play better football, and that way the women can actually have a conversation about what peace building actually means, and the peaceful activity that they can be involved in, those younger people can be involved in. So it's super, super amazing work that they do, but we were working with them around how technology can improve what they were doing, or how technology works with what they're doing. And I gave this example of what they do because this was one of the first examples of where I was met with traumatic subject matter as a designer and a researcher. And one of the women described to me one of these events where they were going out and doing peaceful protest. And it was one of the times where they mentioned that the violence that they received, stones being thrown at them as they were peacefully protesting. Oh, they remarked in a kind of jokey way to me, oh, it got too bad. I was bleeding too badly that I had to stop protesting. And it was said in a very jovial way. And at that point, I wasn't quite sure how to react. And we'll come on to this in a little bit later, but it's just here flagging that working with trauma is a really important subject to work with. And to go into more detail as far as like the workshops and the design activities that we were doing, and really talk about the inclusivity element of this, I've got an example on the screen at the moment of a user journey map, which is sectioned into before, during, and after. And here is when we asked our participants, like the Polycom Development Project women, to map an incident, or a violent incident, a traumatic incident, a crisis, if you were. I think we framed it as a crisis or an incident rather than detailed that it had to have something violent in it. But what we thought we were doing was a pretty standard, a pretty typical design exercise that a lot of people will hopefully find quite familiar. But when you zoom in on some of the content that was written down onto post-it notes and stuck on the board, you start to read things like war and the sound of bullets and deaths and killings and pictures of deaths. And then also things like high food prices and shocked, and lots of different emotions that kind of come up from the users as well. And this was really very difficult for us as people delivering a tech project, a tech tool, and working with research. But it also was something that I absolutely can empathize with the participants of having to, or wanting to also map these things, participating in this activity because they want to improve things. And I did really struggle still, even though I was anticipating this, I did struggle to deal with this kind of content as a designer and researcher working on tech. This, one of the ways in which we tried to mitigate how trauma was being dealt with within the workshops and within the scenarios. There were multiple different ways, but here's an example of my own journey map that I did myself. So I do think that one of the reasons we were able to work with this subject matter so well was the attention that we did pay to trauma in our planning phase. And again, my suspicion is that in some part that is due to myself being a trauma survivor of multiple different kinds of traumas and a person with complex PTSD. So this is my own journey map is on the screen at the moment. It's the Manchester bombing journey map that I created after after it happened or during it happening, what I was doing, how I was responding to news, and how I was checking in with an individual that I knew that had lost somebody during that attack, and yeah, how I was dealing with the information. So this is very, very optional homework for this particular section, is to think of a deeply upsetting event in your life and try to begin to journey map this event. And I can provide some resources on journey mapping if you want to ask me. But what this does, if you can do it, and again, I would advise that anybody that has a lot of triggering and traumatic subject matter themselves that they are working with, that this is why this is a very optional homework. But if you are able to, this really helps you start to begin to build that understanding to your own responses to trauma, traumatic subjects and traumatic events. And also this kind of this subject that I was trying to manage as we were doing these activities around like the commodification of that information into design artifacts, or research, and how we were using this kind of information, and our responsibility when using this kind of information. So yeah, I recommend this activity if you are able to. The other things that we made sure to do to make sure we did this ethically and inclusively and trauma informed was all of the researchers on the project, so not just myself delivering different activities, we went through the same processes. So building user journey maps and describing incidents that we have some experiences of. Researchers' examples were used with consent to build compassionate connection with attendees, with participants of the workshop and of the research for the tools, the tech tools. Attendees and participants were notified pre-workshop of the subject matter. We had psychological support on site, and this was psychological support not just for the participants, but also the researchers. So the researchers were supported post-workshop as well as during the workshop and immediately after. And there was confidentiality and consent built into the entire process. To kind of move on to something that I touched on really briefly when I was talking about Polycom Win. And this is about, as a design researcher, how your reaction to conversations when you're gathering information, whether you're gathering research, is super important. So another, I'm going to use another example, but the first example that I used was around one of the women describing getting harmed as they were peacefully protesting. But this other example was with a session where we were talking about, in relation to the Dispatcher project and crisis resiliency and crisis, was we started to talk about what poverty is and the difference between UK or Western Eurocentric poverty and Kenyan poverty, and how the class systems are very understandably incredibly different, and they will be very, very different in lots of different places. And this just isn't country to country, but this is, community to community. And one of the things that I want to get across to you now is that you need to be ready to understand and listen to those differences and battle any of the bias that might arise from yourself and the ill-informed reactions and opinions you might have. So the example that I have with this individual is that many surprising subjects can arise. So not just the one about poverty, but the example of how we got on to poverty was we were talking about an image being used of a car for ride sharing during resilience crisis response type things. We thought that people would want to have some way of offering other people transport in resilient communities in response to crises. And owning a car and owning a vehicle was seen as a privilege and an immense signal of wealth and a signal of a certain class. And that actually the people that we were researching with that were in these informal settlements, and also not in informal settlements from other areas, but the informal settlements, they found it much more regular and more normal to be using services like Uber, because there was less judgment around using Uber and it was affordable for them as well. So that was something where something very seemingly kind of innocuous from my cultural background became a kind of topic that I really needed to delve into and really needed to on the spot understand. So this piece of advice around this kind of work is about many different subjects coming up when you're conducting this kind of research. Everything from history to culture to politics and poverty is likely gonna arise when you're talking with research participants, and especially within a humanitarian context. And I think one of the other things that's always been a challenge for me to work on is I am white. I am white from the UK, and I have an accent, a UK related accent, and there is inherent historical context around colonialization in some countries that I will be doing work in, especially those that are former colonies. And the best way, I believe, to approach this is with complete honesty and complete transparency, and the readiness to have those kinds of conversations. You don't necessarily need to be perfectly informed and perfectly historically informed. It helps, definitely. But the more willing and informed and able you are to have these kinds of conversations and have this kind of knowledge, the better you're going to relate to communities to be able to do better research in them. On that subject note of doing different kinds of research, I'm going to talk very briefly, and this is going to be very briefly, about two kind of different approaches that I've named myself. These aren't necessarily, I think, technical terms, but these are the ways that I describe these ways of doing research in humanitarian contexts. And the first one is called, I call it deep ethnographic. And the second, I call dip in, dip out researcher. I'm sure that there's a better term for it. I sometimes also call it the ephemeral researcher, but I think that that's not a great way of describing it. But I call it dip in, dip out, that I think is maybe a little bit better way to describe it. But the first thing that I would like to say about these two different approaches that I'm going to describe from my experiences are that neither is right or wrong. It's more, I think, of a preference or an inclination to one type of doing this kind of work. And there will definitely be some bias in how I describe them. So please do excuse the bias that I have for one of these particular methods. But the first method that I am going to describe is one that I learned actually from a colleague, ex-colleague in Ushahidi at the time. And this is actually an image of them just off of screen, so you won't be able to see them, but this is them, a photo of them sat around a low table with community members in Kathmandu, Nepal. They were the Kathmandu Living Labs, and they were working on a mapping project. And this is really, they spent 3 months with this community working on this tech problem. And this to me is what I call deep ethnographic. It's staying there for a long time and working on the problems with the communities. And deep ethnographic doesn't have to look like you as a person from a Eurocentric or Western-centric country going somewhere else, but it can look like the image on the screen at the moment, which is myself with previously named Team Rubicon UK, which they're now called Re.Act. They're a crisis response organisation, and a community resilience team called SARAID, which is the UK-wide search and rescue volunteer organisation. And there's an image of me with Team Rubicon, now React, doing flood prevention measures in Dartmoor, down in the south of the UK. And also this is the image of me with the community resilience SARAID team is us doing a Christmas soup kitchen for people that are on the streets or homeless without permanent accommodation. So deep ethnographic to me means becoming part of the group in a genuine way, becoming part of the community of which you are sometimes researching. And I believe that this can give you incredibly rich information that you would not gather through dip in, dip out approaches, or it's harder to gather in dip out approaches. But the difficult thing with, I think, deep ethnographic work like this becoming part of communities is it does and can lead to bias. Because you are part of that group, and it also can lead to you skewing your thoughts on a particular research subject when you are part of the group. So being self-aware is really key in the deep ethnographic side of things. And the dip in, dip out researcher, it was actually something that we used within Isuku and something that we used within Dispatcher as well. We actually mixed both of these approaches for both of these projects. It really was a preference for the two main designers that were working on the projects at the time, myself included. But I see dip in, dip out as this kind of relationship, which is very much boundaried by the research project, very much boundaried by the kinds of structured or semi-structured questions that you're going to ask and the information that you need to extract over a limited period of time. And I personally do really struggle with this approach because I have a tendency to develop bonds with individuals, especially individuals that share my values around things like crisis response and humanitarian work and violence against women and all these different things. So yeah, I often do find dip in, dip out a harder approach for myself. So just in the last few minutes, I'm going to talk through some really quick tips that are not going to go into great depth on, but one is to stay safe, stay safety aware, and stay healthy. So some of the ways in which you can stay safe when you're doing UX research in humanitarian contexts in places which are typically not going to be your country of residence or where you visited regularly. Take burner phones or spare devices, extra devices in general. Do interviews in pairs or threes. Always make sure that you're conducting your interviews in public and safe public areas that you're familiar with. Try and check out the areas before your interview, but also you're doing this for yourself as researchers, but also do this for your participants as well. Don't just assume your participants and the people that you're working with for technological research are comfortable with a particular location. Ask them and make sure that it's within their financial means, it's within their reasonable life circumstances to go to a location that you have decided on. Some of the other things that are really important is to look into local police structures, local hospital structures, just make sure that you're aware of them and you know. Simulate different scenarios happening if you have time as a research team, and make sure you have travel policies and safety policies as an organization. One thing that I learned to be very aware of as an LGBT plus person, I look at the laws and the criminalization laws around LGBT in different countries always before I travel. And get your vaccinations and get your medication, something I definitely learned after getting sick a couple of times on research trips. So some things that you can practice on your next holiday or vacation that will get you ready for this kind of work if you're looking at doing these kinds of research studies in these kinds of places around humanitarian contexts. Community research online is amazing. So meetup.com, Facebook, any website that you can find where you can look into how communities organize will give you so much information. And this is especially important in our lockdown environment now. The internet and community organizing on the internet is even more prevalent and important. Try and take lots of photos of the places that you go. And don't just take photos of things that you think you need to take photos of like, you doing your activities, but try and take photos of interesting cultural things like posters in cafes or graffiti and notice boards and lots of information from the community. And the last one, which I think brings a lot of horror to certain people, is talking to taxi drivers or people running transport about your given topic. I was awful at this to begin with, but then got a lot better. And honestly, again, this is something that was taught to me by a colleague, the same colleague that taught me how to do more ethnographic work. You can get so much useful, interesting information from people that run and run public services or are part of the public infrastructure or the transport infrastructure. And it's great practice if you can do it where you live and where you're comfortable before you go somewhere else. But also just be aware that this can raise really difficult topics at any time. So again, engage in this kind of conversation, practice when you can, and engage in it safely. The last few pieces of advice are about reading and doing various different kinds of information gathering. Some of my favorite ways to learn how to better research in contexts that are not my lived context are NGO reports, so reports from nonprofits. So one linked here is Leaving No One Behind, the lessons from the Kerala disasters, which was when there was flooding in southwest India over the last few years. And also the one that I always read every single year when it comes out, which the 2020 has just recently come out, is The Mobile Economy in Sub-Saharan Africa from the GSMA. Really fascinating information in NGO-related reports. The second is to go to different conferences and events and listen to people from these organizations and these communities talk about different things. And some of these kinds of conferences that focus on humanitarian technology and humanitarian research is RightsCon, the Internet Freedom Festival, MozFest, so Mozilla's festival. The Peace Tech Labs are an organization that organize different trainings in different countries around how tech can be used to build peace in lots of different ways. And Tech for Good meetups are a great way to enter this, this context as well. There are good orgs that you can follow for lots of different blogs. One of them is the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is EFF.org, Access Now, which is accessnow.org, Advocacy Assembly, which is advocacyassembly.org, and the Center for Humanitarian Data, if you like spreadsheets of lots of data from humanitarian organizations like I do, which is center.humdata.org. Advocacy Assembly is an interesting one because it's a different training videos for human rights activists. So I highly recommend Advocacy Assembly to have a little look at what human rights activists are training themselves in, technology-wise. And the last thing is books. I love books. There are some amazing ones about different these different kinds of subjects around technology and humanitarian work and how to do it well. One is the Digital Economies at Global Margins, which is an MIT press. One is Sharing Cities, Activating the Urban Commons. One is called Dead Aid, and the other is Digital Democracy and Analog Politics. I can share these afterwards. All the slides will be available. The Dead Aid one is especially interesting if you're interested in the complexities around financial aid in quote unquote developing countries. So it's really a straightforward read for a very blunt view on the economic impact of aid in different countries. I love that book so much. And with that, I'd like to say thank you and see whether there's any questions.
Well, thank you, Errol. That was fantastic. I think your talk in 2018 was probably my favorite ID24 talk of all time, and just given us so much more to think about once again. Joe, do you have some questions?
So we've had one question come in from YouTube from Jamila, who has said, related to being perceived as a historical colonizer, as a researcher, do you openly address it with participants? Do you bring it up, or do you wait until you perceive friction?
In my experience, it has been brought to me usually. I think most of the tools that I've worked on in these contexts have been grown out of Kenya. So the organization that I was working at was a Kenyan based organization, and the staff were, more, I think they were equal global other places than Kenya to Kenyan. So we were perceived as a Kenyan organization, and I happened to be I wish I could say European, but I can't anymore, a British person. I know, it's sad. A British person coming in there working for that organization. So, but in my experience, it's always been raised by the participants after a period of being able to build that rapport and that level of comfort about talking about different subjects. It's never usually or rarely raised initially. And I welcome it when it's raised, but I also recognize that in different countries with different contexts and different communities, you bringing that to the conversation without pre-preparation, without notifying that you will, could also be very confrontational in some environments. So I think the reason that I haven't brought it in initially is because it can also be kind of viewed as like you have power within this within this relationship. And one of your jobs to get community-based feedback really is to kind of try as much as you can to break down that power structure. And I think that I've always taken an approach of what do the participants want to bring to me and when, rather than, and the balance is difficult, especially when we were asking them to talk about incidents and traumatic subjects. But we did try to balance it as much as possible. So I would be ready to talk about it, and always have been, and practiced a lot with people that I felt like ready to practice with. Like, so a lot of my colleagues, we've had a lot of really ex-colleagues had a lot of really difficult conversations around it, which have always been you know, amazing for me, probably not for everyone involved. But yeah, I would say that one of the best things that you can do is practice and be ready for it, rather than, unless your tool is directly, or your work is directly looking at how tools can break down colonialization effects.
And do we have time for another question, or is that our time?
Yeah, I think we can very quickly, if it's
so you mentioned some journey mapping resources that you could share. Maybe if you could share them into the YouTube chat or on Twitter, that would be awesome.
Sure.
That would be fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you once again, Errol. That was fantastic. If you like this session, and why wouldn't you, hit that YouTube like button, and please don't forget you can subscribe to youtube.com/inclusivedesign24 to be kept in the loop for our future events. Inclusive Design 24 is brought to you with thanks to Barclays Access, Adobe, Intopia, Tetralogical, InfoAxia, Intuit, WebAble, DQ Systems, and Adrian Roselli, LLC. We will be back on the hour with our next session, which in a change of plans is going to be Mr. Bruce Lawson, talking about whose web is it anyway. Thank you very much.